Marriage in medieval times wasn't just about love. It was about power, property, and honor. A single affair could ruin noble bloodlines, create illegitimate heirs, and spark violent feuds between families. But beyond that, adultery was seen as a moral crime against God. The Church had immense control over medieval laws, and according to religious doctrine, adultery was one of the gravest sins, worthy of extreme punishment. The priest preached that an unfaithful spouse could bring down God's wrath upon an entire community, and yet not all adulterers were treated the same. If a man was caught cheating, the punishment was often a slap on the wrist, maybe a fine or public humiliation. But for a woman, the consequences were far worse. Why? Because medieval society believed a woman's chastity was directly tied to her family's honor and reputation. If she strayed, it was seen as an unforgivable betrayal, not just of her husband, but of her entire lineage. In some cases, a man could even kill his wife for adultery and face no legal consequences. In medieval Europe, public humiliation was one of the most common punishments for adultery, especially for women. While some might consider public shame a lesser punishment compared to mutilation or execution, it was often a fate worse than death. Imagine being stripped of your clothing, your hands bound and your body covered in filth, as you are forced to march through the streets while the entire town watches. This was a reality for many women caught in adultery. In medieval France, adulterous women were often paraded naked through the streets with their heads shaved, considered the ultimate mark of disgrace. The guilty were forced to wear a wooden yoke, called a schandkragen, around their necks, making it impossible to move their heads properly. Some had bells attached, ensuring everyone in town could hear them coming. In Italy, adulterers, especially women, were dressed in rags, sometimes smeared with dung, and made to carry signs that read adulterer or whore. But the humiliation didn't stop at just walking. As the condemned walked through the streets, villagers, many of them women, would spit, throw rotten food, and even beat them with sticks. Some were forced to crawl on their hands and knees, while bystanders kicked and cursed at them. In extreme cases, they had to beg their husbands for forgiveness, while the crowd laughed at them. The public nature of the punishment meant that even if they survived, they could never regain their social standing. Many ended up banished, living in isolation or taking their own lives. For medieval women, long hair was a symbol of beauty and virtue. Having it cut off was a public statement that they had lost their honor. In England, a woman caught in adultery might have her head shaved bald before being whipped through the streets. Some were forced to wear a cap or hood for the rest of their lives, marking them as a fallen woman. In some cases, nuns guilty of affairs were stripped of their veils, shaved and exiled from the convent, doomed to wander alone. This kind of punishment wasn't about physical pain. It was about complete and utter social destruction. But for those who were deemed beyond redemption, the punishments became even more brutal. For many adulterers in the Middle Ages, punishment didn't stop at public humiliation. Some were left with permanent scars, painful reminders of their crimes that ensured they could never escape their past. Unlike public shame, which could eventually fade, mutilation was a lifelong sentence of suffering and disgrace. Imagine being dragged before a judge, found guilty of adultery, and then held down as a knife slices through your face, removing your nose completely. The pain is unbearable, the blood pours down your body, and the crowd watches in approval. In medieval time, cutting off a woman's nose was one of the most common punishments for adultery. The idea was simple. Since beauty was a woman's most valued trait, Removing her nose would make her undesirable forever. In some cases, both the man and woman caught in adultery would suffer this fate, but more often it was only the woman, reinforcing the brutal double standards of medieval society. The practice was so widespread that it had a name: rhinotomy. Some records show that noblewomen were not spared. If a high-born lady was found guilty, she might have her nose and ears cut off before being banished. This was considered a mercy compared to execution. In parts of England and Italy, a guilty woman might lose her ears or lips, making her speech difficult and leaving her disfigured for life. In extreme cases, both men and women had one or both hands cut off, especially if the affair involved an act of deception, like forging love letters or stealing money for secret meetings. Imagine being left with no hands in a world where survival depended on your ability to work. Many who suffered this punishment ended up as beggars, unable to fend for themselves. For those lucky enough to keep their noses and ears, medieval justice had another way of ensuring their crime was never forgotten: branding. In some towns, adulterers were burned with a hot iron on their faces, shoulders, or hands. In Scotland and England, a guilty person might have the letter I, for adulterer, burned into their flesh, a practice that inspired Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter centuries later. Some received marks like W, whore, or C, cheater, permanently labeling them in society. This meant that even if they survived the punishment, they could never return to normal life. Every time someone saw them, they would know exactly what crime they had committed. While women suffered most of the brutal mutilations, some men were not spared either. In certain cases, a man caught in adultery might be castrated, ensuring he could never commit the crime again. This was most commonly done in Italy and Germany, where noblemen wanted to ensure their wives' lovers could never father illegitimate heirs. In some regions, men who seduced noblewomen were not just castrated, they were blinded too. Castration was considered a fate worse than death for medieval men, as it robbed them of both their masculinity and social standing. Many did not survive the procedure, dying from infection or blood loss. In some of the most extreme cases, the punishment didn't stop with mutilation. It ended in slow, painful execution. Some adulterers were tied to horses and dragged through the streets until they died. Others were torn apart by wild dogs, a punishment recorded in medieval Russia. Adultery in the Middle Ages wasn't just a private betrayal. It was a crime against family, honor, and religion. And for those caught, there was little hope of escape. Public humiliation left them broken, mutilation marked them forever, and execution ensured they never sinned again. But perhaps the most terrifying part of all was the brutal double standard. While men often escaped with small fines or warnings, women suffered the worst fates, shamed, scarred, or slaughtered in public spectacle.